Alright, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Hard Bullet VR. This really cool VR title is basically a mix between something like Max Payne, F.E.A.R, and John Wick movies all in one go. And essentially their huge kind of trick here is using bullet time to maximum effect. You will see that bullets will slow down, they'll hit stuff and cause massive damage, and also just create and wreak havoc all around the entire map. The weapon handling in this game is pretty phenomenal, the reloads feel really nice, and all in all it's a pretty solid title in terms of just the amount of fun that you can have. Now currently there are only sandbox modes available, as it looks like whatever story element that was being worked on is still currently in production. It does not seem like it's going to be coming out of early access anytime soon. However, with that said, it is so much fun to just blast around all these different levels. The action is non-stop. The bullet time is pretty much infinite, and you're able to just mess around with all of the enemies in various different fashions. Now, I have taken a really big liking to using the M4. This carbine seems to do a really good job of dispatching most of your enemies rather quickly, and it's a cinch to reload, making it, again, a very good ally in battle. Now, the enemies tend to use a different array of weaponry. Some will also be using some variant of the M4, others will use an Uzi, and some further still will be using a shotgun against you, which definitely makes close quarters battles very intense and very challenging when you end up going into the tactic versus arcade mode, because you will definitely get your health drained rather quickly. The nice thing is that the bullet time also means that if you jump away from the enemies, you have a chance of knocking them back, which is really neat, and in a sense it's almost like the kick that we had in the original F.E.A.R series, allowing the enemies to get pushed back and also dealing a slight amount of damage to them. And you can also see some really cool effects that are happening in terms of the explosions and in terms of the environmental kind of damage that you can do to your enemies as you're blasting around, which again is a lot of fun. It is just an absolute blast tearing apart the levels. Now, while there is no real environmental destruction, there is quite a bit of gibs that happen when you blow enemies apart. Anything from headshots to arms and anything that basically damages lower parts of the body has a chance of gibbing your enemies, sending chunks flying all over the place, which again is a very satisfying kind of feeling, and it gives the shotgun especially a massive bump in power in the way that it feels. Plus, who doesn't like the Franchise Boss? It's an amazing shotgun that we've all kind of liked since the Half-Life 2 days, and before, it's been pretty much a staple in shooting games for a very long time. Now, the reloads on this particular shotgun I'm not the biggest fan of, mainly because the way that you actuate the pump, you have to actually hold the trigger down in order to pull it back. Not my favorite way to do things, but it is what it is. The other downside is that your hand stays on the handguard until you effectively release the hand grip on your controller one more time. Now, this may be less of an issue for somebody who's using live ones, but in my case, due to the fact that I'm using the index controllers, I have to essentially release it twice just to let go of the handguard itself. Now, this isn't so much of a big deal, but again, depending on the controller you might be using for this title, may not be too good in your particular use case. In my particular situation, my hands tend to get pretty tired from having to hold on to the grip constantly. Although I suppose you could just as easily let it go and then only grip again when you need to let go of the handle itself. However, again, in a tight, close quarters situation when you're just trying to get to your shells to reload, it can be a bit of an annoyance, and I haven't found the setting in the controls to disable this, unfortunately. However, it does look like a vast number of controls can be remapped so that you can just use whatever setup that works better for you. Now, at this time, I feel like there are certainly a number of things that will require certain remaps for those of you that are using the index controller to make it just a little bit more comfortable, but I would imagine anybody on the ones, the Oculus controllers, etc. is probably not going to be having too much of a hard time, since those don't use the same kind of capacitive touch technology to the same extent that the index controllers do. Now, the levels right now are pretty sparse. You've only got about 4 maps to play on. Different kind of setups, but by and large, they're all indoor areas, and I would have liked to see some outdoor areas in the game. You can see one tactic here is that after you run out of ammo or you can't reload, you can just toss your enemies around using physics, not unlike what you would see in Boneworks, for example, which makes for a pretty fun experience overall. And again, depending on the hazards in the maps that are available, you may even be able to toss your enemies outside of the map, again in the event that you happen to not be able to reload in time and you get swarmed, which again is a really neat thing to have, and it just makes the world feel a little bit more alive, a little bit more interactive than you could see from some of the other titles that have come out in this space. Now, on the actual weapons themselves, I have found that the knives feel very much like Boneworks, where they don't intersect, and you can basically just kind of have them rest on top of one another. Really, really cool. The one downside I feel like is that the throwing is very difficult on the index controllers, again owing to the fact that you have to release twice. So not my favorite type of deal, but it is what it is. Now, the over and under shotgun is pretty neat. You can reload, and then you can basically kind of just swing your controller back in order to close the latch, which is really neat. But the downside is that if you put your hand on the handguard and try and snap it closed, it unfortunately does not work, which I think is a bit of an oversight, and I wish the developer would actually make that be compatible, just in case, again, your hand gets stuck on a hand grip for one reason or another. This, of course, makes it look a little bit better. The model, however, is really neat. Now, moving on to the next thing here, the handguns I have a bit of an issue with because you can't actually actuate the slide on them from the center or from the top. You have to do it from a very precise spot on the back, and when you go to release the magazines, they have a tendency to get stuck inside the firearm, which means you're going to be swinging that thing around like nobody's business until the magazine finally releases. Again, one of those little pet peeves that I wish they didn't have, as a lot of modern VR titles just have the magazine drop right out as soon as you press the trigger, as if it was spring activated, which again is very helpful, but in this case doesn't quite happen, which makes for a slightly frustrating experience at times. Now, the Beretta has a really cool model to it, but again suffers from the same issue where the slide can only be pulled back from a very specific spot in the back. The cool thing is that when you fire the gun one-handed, you don't have a huge lot of recoil, versus when you go two-handed, it's completely non-existent, which again is a very nice little addition to the handling model that they've introduced in this particular title. Plus, it's just a really cool looking gun. Beretta, of course, again, a staple of many FPS series as well as movies and TV. However, again, I feel like there are some oversights that could have been avoided because, for example, with the Uzi type guns, again, you can see that the magazines have a tendency to catch, which is not exactly the most fun, but it is what it is, and I'm hoping that this is something that they'll fix at some point later on. Now, moving on to the last and final part here, of course, we have the venerable M4, and this one, again, is a really neat gun. Very nice reloads, suffers from the same issue of the magazine release kind of sticking from time to time, but I don't know if that's just my game or if somebody else has experienced this before. However, it is nonetheless a lot of fun to shoot, and is probably one of the best guns in the game in terms of the damage dealt to the enemies overall. So guys, with this said, where is my verdict on this game? Well, I think it is an absolute blast to play this title. I think it's just a lot of fun, you know, blowing away different enemies in slow motion. There's a lot of really cool things that you can do to just kind of mess around with them as you play. There are a number of melee weapons, from knives to pitchforks to using basically the environmental parts to just throw at your enemies, making them essentially very disposable. Plus, you can just use your arms to really mess about with them as if they are nothing but ragdolls, which pretty much they really are in this title. As you can see here, I'll be using the enemy and the environment to my advantage to be able to get rid of some dead weight, so to speak. Again, the title is just an absolute blast to play. You've got a number of different tactical options available to you. There's a decent amount of verticality despite the rather small scale of the levels so far. Now the performance could use a little bit of a boost in my opinion. I'm using a 3700X processor with 32 gigs of RAM running at 32 or 3.2 gigahertz I should say, and as well as a 1080 Ti which is running a slight overclock. Now it is by no means the most beastly computer, but at the same time I feel like the performance here, given the rather tight and compact levels, could be just a little bit better. I do get the occasional dropped frame where I do feel like reprojection is kicking in. But that said, again, early access title, so we could yet see the performance here rather improve and kind of move forward as things advance. Now with that said, despite me having some gripes with the weapons in this title, I feel like the pacing of the action and the general layout of the levels are really simple to understand. Everything just kind of works, and by and large you're going to have an absolute blast in this. I do kind of wish that there was more of a multiplayer component included to this. As it stands right now, there's no PvP, there's only PvE with the AI. However, it is still just a lot of fun to mess around with these guys, even on the limited map set that is available to us right now. So hopefully this video kind of shows you the basics of what this game is, some of the really cool things that you can do, and hopefully you guys enjoy content like this. If you do, go ahead and give the video a like, and I'm going to keep bringing more similar titles to you in the future so that you can check out the growing library of really cool VR content that's now available on Steam, as well as certain Oculus titles that will be coming up. So stick around until the next video, and this has been Crazy Walder.